It had been a quiet town, nestled in a valley surrounded by trees and fields, a place where time seemed to stand still. If you asked anyone about it, they'd tell you there was nothing remarkable about it. Just ordinary streets, houses, and the same people who had lived there for decades. But that was before they dug up the time capsule. It started innocently enough. The town centennial was approaching, and the mayor had come up with a brilliant idea. She suggested opening up a time capsule that had been buried 50 years ago in the park. The idea was met with excitement. People loved to reminisce about the past, to see how things had changed, and to rediscover what had been left behind. There was talk of letters, old photographs, maybe even a newspaper or a coin from that time. Nothing too out of the ordinary. On the day of the excavation, the air was warm, the sun shining down brightly on the eager crowd that had gathered around. It was a mix of curious faces, older folks who remembered the day it was buried, and younger generations who had heard tales of the past but had never experienced it themselves. Everyone was waiting, standing by with anticipation, as the workers set up the equipment. The spot where the time capsule had been buried was marked, and after a few moments, the first few shovels of earth were removed. The workers dug deeper, uncovering the dark soil that had been packed tightly over the decades. With each stroke, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. They were excited, talking amongst themselves about what they might find. Then, after a particularly deep shove of the spade, there was a loud, hollow thunk. It was as if they had hit something solid, something that shouldn't have been there. For a moment, everyone paused, holding their breath. "Careful," the mayor called out, her voice edged with tension. The workers stopped, their eyes wide as they peered into the hole. The man with the shovel leaned in to take a closer look. "It's metal," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "This isn't a box. It's a container of some sort." The crowd buzzed with excitement. A metal container. This wasn't just any time capsule. It was something more, something unusual. The workers carefully dug around it, removing the remaining soil. The metal container slowly emerged from the earth, glistening under the sun, covered in layers of dirt and rust. It was an odd shape, square and with strange markings etched along its surface. It didn't look like any container they had ever seen, certainly not one that belonged in the 1970s. No one knew exactly what it was, but the air around it seemed to grow heavier as they pulled it from the ground. The mayor stepped forward, excitement turning to caution. "Let's open it," she said, though there was an undertone of uncertainty in her voice. The workers stood still, unsure what to do next. This wasn't part of the plan. Finally, the mayor motioned for them to continue. Slowly, carefully, the workers began to unscrew the rusted lid. The screech of metal against metal echoed in the quiet park, sending a ripple of unease through the crowd. It felt wrong. The wind picked up, carrying a chill through the air, as if nature itself was reacting to container's unveiling. When the lid finally came off, the crowd leaned in closer, their faces filled with curiosity. What they saw inside would haunt them forever. The inside of the container was empty, save for a single blackened object resting in the center. It was small, no bigger than a fist, and it looked like it had been placed there recently, not 50 years ago. The object was a sphere smooth and dark, with strange symbols carved into its surface. The symbols were like nothing anyone had seen before, twisted, jagged, and almost alive, as if they were constantly shifting. The mayor was the first to speak. Her voice was a soft whisper, barely audible, but it carried a weight that seemed to freeze the air around them. What is that?" The workers stepped back, unwilling to touch it. There was an unspoken understanding that something wasn't right here. The crowd had begun murmuring again, but this time the tone had shifted. Fear had crept into their voices. Something in the pit of their stomachs told them that this wasn't just a harmless relic from the past. The air around the object was thick, oppressive, and a sense of unease began to settle over everyone. Suddenly, one of the workers, a young man in his 20s, stepped forward. His curiosity had gotten the better of him. Without thinking, he reached out and touched the object. The instant his fingers made contact with the smooth surface, a low hum filled the air. It started as a faint vibration, but it quickly grew louder and more intense. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and a pulse of energy rippled outward from the sphere. sending shock waves through the crowd. "Get back!" the mayor shouted, her voice filled with panic. But it was too late. The young man who had touched the object was now frozen in place. His eyes were wide, his body rigid, as if he were locked in a trance. The sphere began to glow with an eerie, greenish light, casting strange shadows across the crowd. The symbols on its surface started to shift, twisting and changing, as if they were alive. It was as if the object had awakened, and something was now watching them, something ancient and powerful. In an instant, the young man's body convulsed violently, his mouth opening in a silent scream. His fingers dug into the metal of the capsule, as if trying to pull himself away from it, but he couldn't move. The glow from the sphere intensified, and the crowd gasped in terror as a strange symbol seemed to crawl across the young man's skin, appearing where his hands touched the capsule. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the glow disappeared. The hum faded, and the man collapsed to the ground, unconscious, his body twitching as if it had been electrically shocked. The crowd stood in stunned silence, too afraid to approach. The mayor was the first to break the silence. She ran forward, kneeling beside the young man. Is he okay?" Someone asked from the crowd, but she didn't answer. He was still breathing, but barely. His face was pale, his body drenched in sweat, and his eyes flickered open for a brief moment before closing again. It was clear that whatever had happened to him, it wasn't something that could be easily explained. The capsule, however, was quiet once more. The object inside was still glowing faintly, as though it was waiting for something or someone. The unease that had settled over the crowd was now palpable, the air thick with uncertainty. No one knew what they had just witnessed, and no one was brave enough to speak up. They all stood in a strange, unspoken agreement. This discovery was not just a relic of the past. It was something else, something dangerous. The mayor stood slowly, her hands trembling. "We need to get this thing to a safe place now," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "No one is to touch it again until we understand what it is." But the truth was, no one in that crowd had any idea just how much their world was about to change. The next few hours after the discovery were a blur of confusion, panic, and hurried decisions. The young man, whose name was Ryan, had been rushed to the local hospital. Still unconscious, his condition deteriorating rapidly. His heart rate was erratic, and the doctors couldn't explain why he had become so unwell after touching the object. They tried every test they could think of, but there were no answers. Only the terrifying reality that whatever had happened to him was beyond anything they could comprehend. The mayor, standing at the forefront of the frantic scene, was trying to maintain control. She knew this was no ordinary event, no mere curiosity uncovered by an innocent celebration. The capsule, the object, and the energy it emitted, it was all far too strange, too alien to be understood in a moment's notice. But one thing was certain, this was far from over. The town had just unlocked something far darker than anyone had ever imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town, the capsule was taken to the old town hall. It had been emptied for years, serving as little more than a relic of the past, and now it was a makeshift containment facility for something that defied logic. Armed guards surrounded the building, ensuring no one could get close to the object again. Inside, a team of experts had been summoned. Archaeologists, physicists, historians, anyone with a shred of expertise in the unexplained. Among them was Dr. Evelyn Clark, a renowned expert in ancient artifacts and obscure phenomena. She had heard rumors of the discovery and insisted on coming despite the warnings. As she entered the hall, she immediately felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The room was dimly lit, and the air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, as if the object itself was alive, waiting to be understood. Dr. Clark had spent most of her career studying things that were, well, unexplainable. But even she could admit that what they were dealing with now was beyond her expertise. The object sat in the center of the room, a blackened sphere covered in symbols that twisted and shifted, never quite staying the same. It pulsed faintly, like a heart that beat to a rhythm no one could comprehend. "Is this thing safe?" one of the officers asked, his voice tight with fear. His hands were shaking as he watched the object from the corner of the room. Dr. Clark took a slow breath and walked closer to the capsule. She observed it closely, her eyes tracing the shifting markings on its surface. "Safe?" she repeated. "I don't think safe is the word we should be using here. This isn't just a time capsule. It's something else." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over everyone. What exactly were they dealing with? No one knew, but they all felt the answer was somewhere in that strange object. The mayor stepped forward, her voice steady but strained. "Dr. Clark, you've studied things like this before. What is it? Where did it come from?" "I don't know," Dr. Clark admitted. She paused for a moment, studying the object again. "But I have seen symbols like these before. Not in history books or ancient texts, but in something much older, something buried deep in the lore of lost civilizations. This object doesn't belong here in this time." "What do you mean?" another member of the team asked, his eyes narrowing. "Are you saying this is not from Earth?" Dr. Clark's eyes met his, and in that moment, everyone in the room could see the fear in her expression. "I don't know, but I've heard legends. Stories passed down through the generations, whispered in the shadows. Stories of beings from the stars who left artifact behind, their purpose unknown. This object could be one of those." The room fell into an eerie silence. No one spoke, but the tension was palpable. They had all been hoping for an answer, some kind of rational explanation that could fit into the world they understood. But Dr. Clark's words had shattered that hope. What they had found was not just an artifact. It was a key to something far greater, something none of them were prepared to understand. Outside, the winds had begun to pick up, howling through the streets of the town. It was as though nature itself was responding to the unnatural presence within the town hall. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. No one knew it yet, but the consequences of their actions were already unfolding. Back at the hospital, Ryan's condition was worsening. His body, still unconscious, had begun to undergo strange changes. His doctors had noticed an odd pattern in his vitals. His skin was becoming paler by the hour, his temperature fluctuating wildly. But the most disturbing change was in his eyes. They had turned a murky, translucent white, as though they had lost all pigment. The doctors couldn't explain it. By the time Dr. Clark and the others left the town hall that night, they knew one thing. The object was not just a relic. It was alive, or at least it had some connection to something far beyond their understanding. They hadn't even begun to scratch the surface of what it could do as the group departed. One of the officers lingered in the hall, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching him from the darkness. He turned to glance at the object, and for a fleeting moment, the shifting symbols seemed to change, becoming more jagged, more aggressive. The hum that had filled the room earlier began to pulse again, low and steady. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. The officer froze, his heart racing as he heard a whisper, barely audible, that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the room. "Help me?" It was soft, almost like a plea, faint but undeniable. The officer's blood ran cold as the room grew colder still. He reached for his radio, but when he turned to look at the object again, the symbols had changed. They were no longer shifting in random patterns. They were now forming words that none of them could understand, but words that seemed to pulse with an urgency that filled the officer with dread. The room had grown darker, the hum louder, and the officer's vision blurred as though the very air around him was thickening. It was as if the object was reaching out to him, pulling him into its dark, twisted reality. And then, without warning, the lights went out completely. The officer stood alone in the dark room, the whispers continuing in the silence. It was the beginning of something far worse than they could have ever imagined. The days that followed the discovery were marked by confusion, fear, and an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to hang over the town like a thick fog. The object, now securely locked away in the town hall, continued to pulse with an eerie, greenish glow, despite the efforts of scientists and experts to contain it. The energy it emitted was unmistakable, strange, almost hypnotic, and utterly alien. The mayor had called for a town meeting. The town's residents, who had once come together to celebrate the town's history and unity, now gathered in fear. It was clear that the discovery of the time capsule had unleashed something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. There was no longer any doubt. The object was not of this world. It had to be kept under control, but no one knew how to do that. Inside the town hall, Dr. Clark paced back and forth in front of a small group of scientists and government officials, all of whom had been summoned to help decipher the mystery. They had already begun to study the object, but the results were as bizarre as they were alarming. No one could explain the strange symbols that covered its surface, nor could they determine the material from which it was made. It was as though the object had no place in the world they knew. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Clark admitted, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. "We've tried every test, radiology, chemical analysis, even spectral imaging, but every result is inconclusive. This object, it doesn't belong here." The mayor stood at the back of the room, watching as the experts examined the sphere. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions. How had it ended up in their town? Why had it been buried so long ago? And what was it that caused the strange, unexplainable reaction when it had been touched? As the experts continued their work, Ryan's condition continued to deteriorate. He remained in a coma, his body becoming increasingly frail. The hospital staff had done all they could, but it was clear that whatever had happened to him after his contact with the object was beyond their understanding. On the third day, something happened that none of them could have anticipated. The object in the town hall began to behave differently. The low hum, which had been a constant presence since the moment it was unearthed, suddenly grew louder. The air in the room seemed to grow heavy, and the temperature dropped sharply. One by one, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The experts, caught off guard, scrambled to get their equipment. But before they could, a voice echoed through the silence. It wasn't a whisper this time, but a clear, unmistakable voice, low and guttural, reverberating as though it came from deep within the earth itself. "Let me out." The room fell silent in shock. No one moved, no one spoke. For a moment, all that could be heard was a rhythmic pounding of their own hearts. Then Dr. Clark, trembling but resolute, stepped forward. Did anyone else hear that?" she asked, her voice shaky. Everyone in the room nodded, their faces pale with fear. The voice came again, this time louder, more desperate. "Let me out before it's too late." It was clear that the object wasn't just an artifact. It was a prison, and whatever had been sealed, inside, it was trying to escape. "Do you think it's alive?" one of the experts asked, his voice tight with fear. Dr. Clark nodded slowly, a sense of dread creeping up her spine. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's trying to communicate with us. We have to be careful." The atmosphere in the room had shifted. What had once seemed like a fascinating discovery was now a living nightmare. The object wasn't just a relic from the past. It was a prison for something that had been buried for a reason. And whatever that thing was, it was not happy to be trapped. Outside the town hall, the wind began to howl. It was as if the very weather itself was reacting to the presence of the object. The trees bent and swayed violently, their branches creaking as though they were being twisted by an invisible force. The ground rumbled faintly, and the distant sound of thunder echoed in the distance. Dr. Clark couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a terrible mistake by uncovering the capsule. The object was not a time capsule. It was a containment unit. Whatever had been sealed inside it had been kept hidden for a reason, and now that it had been disturbed, the town would pay the price. "We need to contain it," Dr. Clark said urgently. "Whatever is inside, it's growing stronger. We have to lock it back up and keep it from escaping." But the mayor was already shaking her head. "It's too late. We can't just bury it again. We don't know what we're dealing with. This thing, this creature, it's not something we can control. It's already out of our hands." Just then, a piercing scream echoed from the direction of the hospital. The sound was blood-curdling, so desperate, so full of terror that it made everyone in the room freeze. Without a word, they all rushed toward the source of the scream. The mayor, leading the group, could feel her pulse quickening. She had no idea what awaited them, but she knew that whatever it was, it had something to do with the object they had uncovered. When they arrived at the hospital, the scene before them was like something from a nightmare. Ryan, the young man who had touched the object days before, was standing in the middle of the room, his eyes wide and vacant. His skin had taken on an unnatural pallor, his mouth moving soundlessly, as though he were speaking to something only he could see. The hospital staff, who had been trying to revive him, stood frozen in shock. They, too, had seen the change in him, the transformation that had taken place since the day he touched the sphere. "Ryan?" the mayor called out, her voice trembling. "Ryan, can you hear me?" He turned toward her slowly, and when he spoke, it was not his voice. It was deeper, raspier, alien, as though the words were being forced from him. "They are coming," Ryan whispered. "They are coming for you. For all of you." Before anyone could react, he collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing. The air in the room thickened and the lights flickered again, casting shadows that seemed to grow longer, darker. The transformation was complete. Ryan was no longer just a victim. He was a vessel, and whatever had been inside the capsule had now found a way to escape. A distant, low rumble shook the walls, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. The town was in danger, and the real nightmare was only just beginning. You said the chaos in the hospital escalated as Ryan's body continued to convulse on the floor. The doctors and nurses were helpless, frozen in place by the eerie transformation they had just witnessed. No one had expected something like this. No one had expected the object to be so alive. But the truth was undeniable now. Whatever had been sealed away for 50 years was far from a simple artifact. It was a sentient, malevolent force, and it had found a way to escape. The mayor stood in the doorway of the room, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene before her. Ryan's body twitched unnaturally. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his mouth moved as though speaking in an unknown language. The sound that came from him was a low, guttural growl, like something ancient, something long forgotten. His body was a vessel, a conduit through which whatever was inside the object could now reach the outside world. Dr. Clark, standing beside her, could barely contain the terror that was rising within her. "We need to contain him," she said, her voice urgent. "Whatever he's become, it's not him anymore. We have to stop it before it spreads." But the mayor was already shaking her head. "It's too late for that. The object is alive, and it's using Ryan to communicate with us. Whatever it is, it's been sealed away for a reason. It's been waiting for this moment for 50 years. The rumbling outside had grown louder, the earth beneath them shaking with an unnatural force. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon was no longer just a thunderstorm. It was something far worse. The winds had picked up to a terrifying speed, howling through the streets of the town, as if they were being guided by a force of pure malice. The once peaceful town had become a war zone in the blink of an eye. "Where's the object?" Dr. Clark demanded, her eyes scanning the room. "We need to contain it before it gets worse. We can't let whatever is inside reach its full potential." The mayor hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's still the town hall, but we have no idea what it's capable of. We've been trying to contain it, but I'm afraid it's already too far gone." Ryan's body spasmed again, this time with a violent force. The doctors and nurses who had been attempting to restrain him were thrown back against the walls, their bodies slamming into the hard surfaces with sickening thuds. It was as though Ryan had become an extension of something far more powerful, something that could not be controlled. From the corner of the room, a low, inhuman voice echoed. "It's too late. You cannot stop it." The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't Ryan anymore. It was something else, something that had taken over him. The realization hit like a thunderclap. They had unleashed something that could never be put back. It wasn't just a capsule that had been waiting for 50 years. It was a creature inside it, and it was now free. The mayor rushed to Ryan's side, but before she could reach him, the hospital's windows shattered, and a fierce gust of wind blasted through the room. The lights flickered and then went out entirely, leaving the entire building in darkness. Panic spread like wildfire as the storm outside intensified, shaking the very foundation of the hospital. "Get out!" someone screamed from the back of the room. "We have to get out of here." But there was no escaping. The creature, whatever it was, had already begun its influence on the town. The once quiet streets were now filled with strange, pulsing energy. The people who had been in the town hall, studying the object, began to act strangely. Some wandered aimlessly, their eyes vacant and empty. Others screamed, their voices distorted by fear, as though they could feel the creature's influence seeping into their minds. Dr. Clark pushed her way through the crowd, trying to reach the door, but the air was thick with something, a force that seemed to pull her back, preventing her from moving forward. She turned to the mayor, who had stayed by Ryan's side. "We need to get to town hall," Dr. Clark urged. "We have to destroy the object before it spreads any further. If we don't, the world could be at risk." The mayor looked down at Ryan, whose body had gone completely still. His eyes were no longer vacant. They were glowing, an unnatural white light radiating from them. He was no longer human. He had become something else, something monstrous. Without another word, the mayor nodded, and the two women turned and sprinted out of the hospital. The storm outside had intensified to a near-apocalyptic level. The streets were flooded, the wind howling through the trees, pulling them from their roots. It was as though the entire town was being torn apart, piece by piece, by the force that had been unleashed. They made their way through the chaos, dodging debris and people who had lost all semblance of control. The object was in the town hall, and they had to reach it before the entire town succumbed to its influence. When they arrived at the town hall, the doors were already wide open, the building eerily quiet. The guards who had been stationed there were nowhere to be seen. The mayor hesitated, her hand on the doorframe, her mind racing with fear. "What if it's too late?" she whispered, more to herself than to Dr. Clark. "What if we can't stop it?" "We have no choice," Dr. Clark replied, her voice steady despite the terror she felt. "We have to try." They entered the town hall, the air thick with an unsettling energy. The object sat in the center of the room, glowing with intensity that made the walls vibrate. It was no longer just a strange relic. It was a source of pure malevolence. The very air around it seemed to hum with power, and as they approached, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer just voices. They were commands, demands, pulling at their minds. Dr. Clark reached for the object, but the moment her hand touched it, a searing pain shot through her entire body. She cried out, pulling her hand back, but the damage had already been done. Her vision blurred as the voices inside her mind grew louder, more insistent. "You cannot stop it. You cannot win. It is already too late." Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, gasping for air. The mayor rushed to her side, but was too late. The creature inside the object was taking control of her, just as it had taken control of Ryan. And as the town hall began to collapse around them, the last thing they heard was a low, guttural voice. "It's over. This town belongs to us now." The end was near, but what would come next was even more horrifying than they could have ever imagined. The entire town seemed to be in chaos, consumed by the energy that had been unleashed by the object in the town hall. The storm raged outside, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside the minds of townspeople. The creature's influence spread like a disease, infecting everyone it touched, driving them into madness, turning them into something else. The mayor and Dr. Clark lay on the cold, cracked floor of the town hall, the power of the object pulsing violently through their bodies. The mayor could feel her mind slipping away, a torrent of voices filling her head, forcing her to relive memories she had long buried. These were not just any voices. These were whispers from creature itself, demanding obedience, promising power in exchange for surrender. "Join us," the voice echoed in her mind. "Become one with us. There is no escape." Dr. Clark, though weakened, fought against the pull, trying desperately to hold on to her sense of self. She clutched her head, her breaths coming in shallow gasps, but it was no use. The influence was too strong, too overpowering. The creature's presence had seeped into every corner of her mind, filling it with thoughts that were not her own. The mayor, her body trembling with fear and confusion, grabbed Dr. Clark's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't give in. We need to destroy it, or we're all lost." But Dr. Clark, her vision blurring, could hardly respond. "How?" she managed to whisper. "It's too powerful. The capsule, it's alive." And then, as if the very universe had decided that they were not meant to fight this battle alone, the earth trembled once more. The entire town seemed to quake beneath their feet, as if the land itself was protesting against the creature's presence. Outside, the wind howled even louder, and the once peaceful streets were now filled with screams. Screams of terror, of agony, of people losing themselves to the creature's influence. The air was thick, charged with an unnatural energy, and the ground seemed to pulse in rhythm with the object in the town hall. And then, in the midst of this nightmare, something unexpected happened. A voice, clear, commanding, rang out over the storm. It was not the voice of the creature, nor the whispers in the mayor and Dr. Clark's heads. No, this was a voice that carried an authority all its own. Release them. The voice was like a bell, cutting through the madness. For a moment, everything stopped. The storm outside seemed to quiet, the rumbling of the earth fading, and the whispers in their minds grew silent. The mayor and Dr. Clark both looked up, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Who could have spoken like that? A figure stepped forward from the shadows in the corner of the room. At first, it seemed as though it was a trick of the light, a shadow flickering in the dim glow of the object. But then, the figure became clearer, more solid. A man, tall, his features sharp, his eyes glowing faintly, stood before them. He wore a long coat, and though the air around was cold, there was an aura of calm, of control. The creature's whispers had gone quiet in his presence, as though they feared him. The mayor tried to rise, but her legs felt weak, as if the very strength was being drained from her. The man seemed to notice, and he extended a hand, his gaze steady and filled with quiet authority. "Who are you?" Dr. Clark gasped, her voice hoarse from the strain. The man gave a small smile, but it was not one of reassurance. "I've been waiting for this moment for a long time," he said, his voice calm, almost as if he were speaking to old friends rather than victims of unimaginable terror. "My name is Elias, and I am here to end this." The mayor and Dr. Clark exchanged a confused look. "End it?" the mayor asked, barely able to speak. "And what? This thing, this creature, it's out of control. We can't stop it." Elias nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering from the pulsating object in the center of the room. "That's exactly what they want you to believe. They want you to think you're helpless, that you cannot fight it. But that is a lie." The creature's presence seemed to recoil, as though it could sense a shift in the air, the strength of Elias's words. But the mayor couldn't understand. If Elias was here to help, why hadn't he done something earlier? Why had it taken so long for him to show up? "You've been waiting for this?" Dr. Clark asked, still trembling. "Waiting for the creature to take over? You must be insane." Elias's eyes narrowed. "I haven't been waiting for the creature to take over. I've been waiting for you to uncover the truth. You see, this isn't just about what's in that object. It's about what you've been taught to believe, what the townspeople have been taught to believe." "What are you talking about?" The mayor was barely holding on to her sanity, but her curiosity drove her to ask the question. She couldn't afford to ignore this man, not with everything that had happened. Elias stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "That capsule, that so-called time capsule, was never meant to be buried. It was part of something much bigger. You see, the object wasn't a relic of the past. It was a warning, a trap." Dr. Clark looked at him in disbelief. "A trap? But we thought it was." "A warning," Elias interrupted. "A warning not just for your town, but for the world. That object was meant to contain something far worse than you can comprehend, and it was never meant to be opened. But you did, and now you've unleashed it." The mayor's mind raced. "What is it? What is it?" Elias took a deep breath, his eyes flickering to the object that still sat at the center of the room, glowing ominously. "That creature is not from this world. It's not even from this dimension. It was a being, a force, brought here from a different plane of existence, a place where the laws of nature do not apply. It was sealed away for a reason, and now that it's free, nothing will stop it unless you do what is necessary." Dr. Clark, almost beyond understanding, could only ask, "And what is that?" Elias stepped closer, his voice growing more intense. "You have to destroy it. Destroy the object." The air grew heavier as the object pulsed again, and for the first time, the mayor felt a spark of hope. The object had taken everything from them. People, sanity, safety. But now, perhaps Elias was right. It could be destroyed. She could destroy it. They could end this nightmare. We need to act quickly, Elias urged, before it's too late. Dr. Clark and the mayor exchanged one last glance, their resolve hardening. They had come this far, and now they would finish it. Together, they approached the object, their hearts racing. As they reached out, the room seemed to close in around them, the whispers growing louder, the pressure building. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. With a final, unified push, they struck, and the object shattered. The storm outside ceased. The whispers died, and the world was still. The creature's hold on the town was broken. The nightmare had ended. But as they stood there, surrounded by the ruins of the object, a single thought lingered in the air. The creature may have been destroyed, but something far darker had been released. The real question was, what now?